don't see anything.
Good.
There it goes.
We'll call to order the joint committee meeting of Finance and Laws and Ordinance Committee this evening. It's a little past 6:30. And we have a 60-minute session this evening, but I will compliment the administration and Jonathan Millay on providing a wealth of detailed, comprehensive summaries of potential TIF levels. Tonight, we have a very important piece on the agenda. It has been amended, I will note, and there's fill in the blanks right now. And we'll start the discussion with the current proposal before us for the 75, 10-year, $1 million funding of infrastructure improvements for the proposed Melway residential area. And that is one that is consistent with the Ohio Revised Code, as is noted by the developer and confirmed via Jonathan Millay. It is a program that other entities have utilized successfully, but it does come at a significant cost and a significant potential exposure for the city of Worcester. And Jonathan has done a very nice top-level summary that we're all aware of in terms of what the prior request, the original request is a better term, was made for. And one of the things that we'll try to achieve tonight is come up with a consensus opinion. And based on feedback from constituents, the school, Worcester Growth Corporation, and other members of council in discussion. And again, the city has done their due diligence, meeting with two respective council members to discuss this pending piece of legislation in non-violation of the sunshine laws to get a better understanding of the directional approach that we want to take on this very important precedent, because recognizing that once we establish a program that other developers potentially could line up and expect the same level of funding to support their residential expansions within our area. This is a unique and highly visible initiative because we heard from chief industry leaders within our community that affordable housing in the $200,000 ranges were lacking in Worcester, and their mid-management and staff personnel were having to commute. We have had significant job growth in Worcester, but that's being hampered by the lack of middle income housing. I won't call it low income housing, but middle income housing within our community. So the first item of discussion on the agenda is the current proposed legislation as it was originally proposed that I've summarized, 2020-21. Now we have 2020-22 that has fill in the blanks. So committee representatives, Mr. Myers, Mr. Sanders, and Craig, I don't know who else is on the Laws and Ordinance Committee. You, Scott, and I are on the Finance Committee. Laws and Orders, Jen, and who else is on the Laws and Ordinances?
I am.
David.
Good. And David. So I'll open the floor for discussion regarding the pending request before we look at some possible alternative options or proposed revisions. Before I turn over the floor to the other committee members, again, from the feedback that I've received, the proposal as it stands currently has a low probability of being approved on council chambers floor as it exists today. So that being noted, I will turn the floor over to other committee members for their input. And Craig, I'll start with you, and then let's do the Finance Committee. Then we'll go to Laws and Ordinance Committee for committee member input prior to opening it up to the rest of council. Thank you. Craig, the floor is yours.
John, thank you. As we've seen with all the information, both from the city and also from the applicant, Mr. Ansel is correct that the applicant at this particular point in time is really asking us to move forward with that would be the $1 million TIF that would assume the 37.5% of the new value generated from the development based on the 72 homes, which, like you say, was a written exhibit A, or was exhibit A in the written exhibit from the last meeting. And at this point, I know that's the one that they would like to have us pass. And at this point in time, I guess I'll yield the floor to someone else to discuss.
Mr. Myers, your input next, please.
I've got a question for when this was over a year ago, when they came to us with this development request. I think they were looking for a CRA. What was the amount of the CRA at that time? And was it $1 million?
Jonathan, would you answer that question? I think it was in excess of $1 million over the 10-year CRA term as proposed.
Correct. Originally, the idea was a 10-year, 50% CRA. That would be 10 years per home, so that equates to over $1 million.
Thank you, Jonathan. And that was just for public insight. That was not deemed a viable option to pursue for a number of reasons, even though other municipalities have utilized that CRA in this particular case. It was not agreed to be a viable option to move forward. So we then began a alternative option via the TIF.
And what's the general idea of why? I think John, you mentioned that the as requested is not likely to pass, and that's why we have a fill in the blank option.
Yes. Well, and again, I don't want to spend a lot of time reiterating history. We know the history of the CRA request and have a detailed commentary from the administration. And we did convince the developer to pursue a comparably funded TIF option that does have better legalistic optics than the CRA. And that's where we're at today. And we did lose some time, and they provided a very detailed timeline, chronological timeline. But you're right, Mr. Myers, we started discussion on that in May of 2019. So here we are today, fast forward, and we've worked diligently. We've calculated many scenarios. The developer opted to go with not the most aggressive. I will certainly highlight that. They could have adhered to Ohio Revised Code and asked for more. But the developer, in good conscience, did go with a lesser value, hoping to get quicker buy-in. And we're at the crossroads today of letting the legislation stand as originally presented and let it go to vote and see how it fares. And if it is rejected, we can discuss moving on. However, tonight's committee meeting, we have other options as outlined. There's actually 3 other viable options, and a 4th even provided by the developer most recently. And Jonathan, you've summarized that well. And that would actually be a richer program than the current one that we have before us. So assuming that if we can't have a consensus opinion on the current legislation, a richer one, more streamlined one, albeit, would not be in favor either. So other Laws and Ordinance Committee members would like to provide input for discussion. Mr. Silvestri?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ansel. I want to thank the city administration for taking up their time to answer my questions and meet in person. I want to also thank the developer and the Chamber of Commerce for also answering my questions and giving me their perspective. after much consideration and poring over numbers and calculating figures, where I stand tonight is I don't feel that we should subsidize this type of a residential development on the backs of the Worcester City taxpayers. And it's not even a concept I can support. So, you know, we've done business a certain way, and we've left it up to private enterprise. We left it up to private developers and the private sector to do what they do in terms of residential development. I think as far as low income housing, that is a need. And I think we've addressed that, and we've thrown our weight behind projects like the Brownstone project that are going to help fill that need. This particular project, this type of project is not one that I, with a clear conscience, can give my vote of taxpayer dollars to help fund. I think there are other options. I think there are other private sector entities that if they want to get involved and take a risk and benefit from that risk, if all goes well, I think that they can step out and do that. But for me to do that with taxpayer dollars is, I think, setting a dangerous precedent. I think the mayor said to be careful with this. And I feel even different than that. I feel that it's not even an idea at this point that I can support. So thank you, Mr. Ansel.
Councilman Silvestri, thank you for your very straightforward and quick to the cut to the chase insight and feedback. That's very welcome. And that's why we can maintain the brevity of this meeting this evening. We can all talk candidly, certainly not a vote, but dialogue is important. And Ms. Warden, we'll let you have your comments and feedback before we have kind of a recap, before we let other council representatives provide their insights.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Ansel. I pretty much completely, oh, sorry, I thought John was pointing. I completely agree with Mr. Silvestri. I don't think this is something I can support. Really, I feel like we should just allow market forces to determine whether or not this is a development that's going to sink or swim. I feel like the developer stands a pretty solid chance of, if what he and his the members of the community that he brought to the last meeting in order to discuss our local economy, if they're accurate and if their predictions are accurate, then he stands a pretty good chance of making a healthy profit on this, regardless of putting this on the shoulders of the taxpayers. So that's where it lands. If we decide to move forward with this, I definitely would like to have input in terms of the criteria that we would, which I know this meeting is about, but from the get-go, I'm opposed to it.
Thank you, Ms. Warden. That being noted, with such strong positions on the TIF concept, the lowest level TIF that has been considered, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, is the 35% of public infrastructure cost up to about $415,000. Of course, that's our city's estimated costs for required infrastructure improvements. That would allow the developer to have some upfront money, cover a portion of the infrastructure cost. The developer also then could pursue non-prevailing wage subcontractors that would further reduce the cost, projected at about $137,000. And that would have a proposed payback or a projected payback in about 11 years, with an upside for the city, perhaps a small profit on its loan, if you will, and no impact to the schools. So, but it still would be a loan of taxpayers' money on required infrastructure. But that's the lowest level that we've even reviewed at this point in time. So if it's a hard no on any excuse me, subsidy, the current level is certainly not going to be acceptable. And a revised level at the lowest level sounds like it would not be acceptable, and it may not be acceptable to the developer at that point in time. In dialogue that I've had with the developer, that doesn't seem to be a level of interest. And I too would only feel comfortable with that level and not the additional funding levels outlined. So I'll kind of give you my indication of my position. The current proposal, I could not support either at its current level and exposure. And I have to say that I've not received more public feedback against a proposed initiative since my time on council as I have on this one. So that's a resounding type of voice that we're hearing from the community. And I think at the third level, as outlined, we would even receive school endorsement according to feedback, indirect feedback, not direct feedback, because there would be no harm and no foul to them potentially. But it's significantly less than what the developer is requesting. But again, we're on the right path right now. We're getting something done. And again, it would allow a structured precedent from the administration's perspective if a future developer wanted to, invest 2/3 or 60% in infrastructure and then do the rest of the development with a reasonable payback for the city and no impact to the schools might conceptually work. But again, that's something that at this point in time, feedback from the developer and the developer's representative is that would not be acceptable. So let's continue. We're doing great here. I mean, we've accomplished a lot in 20 minutes. Again, be straightforward, be concise, and let's cut to the chase on this important issue because we've spent enough time riding this horse. It's about time to get off and let that horse rest. So Mr. Bostancic, we'll turn it over to you, please.
Okay, thank you. For this particular project, I'm not in support of any TIF at all. I don't think it's needed. Even at a reduced rate, I think would set a bad precedent. At some point in the future, if there was a development or somebody wanted to develop a particularly challenging piece of land and had truly interested in doing affordable housing, I'm thinking, like it all varies what you think is affordable, but in a lower amount, then I could see perhaps a use of a TIF to get it going. But for this type of housing at this price point, does not make any sense at all. And I think it'd be a colossal waste of taxpayer money, in my opinion. And I think you all got a letter I sent too. And what I said last week pretty much said it all too. So
Mr. Bostancic, I want to thank you for that very concise and thorough summation of your 8 bullet points in reason for objecting this specific. I'm sure council has seen that. It was a very nice summation, and I agree with all points noted. And your point is of particular relevance because there are some blighted properties that have been demised and are in challenged areas that have the potential of more affordable housing in the low 100s range at some future date that have some challenging issues with topography and so forth. So thank you for your open-mindedness as it relates to some of those future initiatives and also your position on this particular initiative.
thank you.
Okay, who else is on that would like? Mark Cavan?
Hi.
Councilman Cavan?
Right. Yes, thank you. I read Bill's letter as well, and I do agree with David and Jen. I don't believe it's needed. I would oppose it. I mean, it's speculation on is it going to sell? Is it not? I mean, even if it does, so I think that is a burden that a developer would need to bear, not the taxpayers of Worcester. So I don't think it's needed, and I wouldn't support it.
Thank you, Mr. Cavan. President Beitendijk, any feedback or input you would like to make? You're still muted.
Well, I think it's another tool in our tool belt that we just shouldn't dismiss whole cloth. Maybe this wasn't the project, and frankly, when I had originally contemplated including a TIF, had anticipated, preparing it. Which then set the parameters that the council was willing to look at, and then anyone and then we would
Hey, Mike.
President Biden,
we'd already had.
We only heard about every 10th word. So
I was going to
apology.
suggest that you disconnect and come back into the meeting, and I'll let you back in because your connection's very bad.
Well, let me interject while he's coming back.
Sound
While we have the rest of the audience here, because President Buitendijk is on to something I think that has merit and resonates with Councilman Bostancic's opinion. There could be future opportunities, and that's the cool thing about being a council representative. We can evaluate those opportunities. And I will say for future project, the criteria that I would consider adopting would be back to the 35% of the public infrastructure cost. It allows non-prevailing wage. It has a reasonable payback period, and the schools are not impacted. So those are the 3 boxes to check. Well, and then the blighted area, that's a certainly an adder, but we're just trying to cut to the chase here and come up with some top level criteria. If the developer is going to do 65% of infrastructure and the city believes it's something that's going to benefit the community, 35% is not too much, it's reasonable. And when we do the math, if it has a reasonable payback and holds the school harmless, then at that point in time, it's nothing more than a bridge loan over a period of 10 or 11 years. If the project builds out faster, it pays off faster. Andre and Jonathan, they've went through the math with me. If it goes a little longer, 12 or 13 years, but it's still on a serving trend within our community, it's still all good. We're going to get our money back. It's kind of like a bond funding initiative. So we're getting some real traction now with potential criteria that may pass the review of council. Maybe not. That's what we're going to have to look at every project for, and its entirety and its uniqueness and what our perspective is regarding the public impact, the positive impact it's going to make within our community. So again, we're making great progress. I mean, we haven't even been on 30 minutes and we thought we were going to have to do this for 2 hours. So I will say this, the really good thing is council, city administration, you've done your homework. The data has been extremely thorough and concise. We went into this eyes wide open. And I tell you, 3 months ago, we were in the dark. We had flashlights, but not with very high beams at that point in time because it was new, it was unique, and we didn't have all the numbers. But in the last month and a half to 2 months, we've been inundated with the impact that this could and will have if we decide to proceed with it. So it's been a great enlightenment process, and the progress we've made is very substantial. And I too, like President Buitendijk highlight and Councilman Bostancic, we need to keep this in our tool belt for other potential projects. And we know there are some out there pending that are lower cost housing and distressed and blighted areas that we may have to jumpstart this to serve our community in the best way. So any other
Ansel?
Yes, Mr. Myers, please.
Just a question, and then I want to state my opinion, but isn't this what the city administration recommended to the developer?
Yes, it is. After we started in a year ago or over a year ago, when they were asking us directly about a CRA, and we said we'd look into it as we do with any type of position out there. So we looked into it many times with and through Worcester Growth. In fact, we had 2 subcommittee meetings on whether we could extend the CRA out there. And after we had done a long and very intense study, we said, this is not a good fit for CRA. It is not redeveloping anything. It's a greenfield site. And that's when we then started, well, actually then the developer pulled his request, and we thought it was over until about a month or so after that. And he came back and said, well, wait a minute, I'm still trying to move this forward. And that's when we started looking at a TIF, and did quite a bit of research on a TIF. And it is a good vehicle as far as us and the administration are concerned. It is a reasonable thing to have in our tool belt, and will provide options that a CRA would not. So I think it was well worth the time investigating it, and it will be useful at some point, I believe.
Yes, Joel, please.
Just to add on to what Bob said, we initially were approached by the developer and his representatives to investigate a TIF. And they gave us some of that information, such as look at Springfield and some other areas. Initially, we weren't aware that a TIF could be used for housing initially. So that actually was brought to our attention by the developer or his representative. And that's when we started looking into it more earnestly.
And Joel, for clarity, excuse me, Joel, just for clarity, had the option 3 general discussion occurred regarding the 35% of infrastructure cost and the general concept as outlined in option 3 or not?
We had initial discussions of reduced amounts, yes.
Okay.
Early on, but those, didn't make it very far.
Those were deal stoppers, correct? Anything less than what was being requested?
It appeared to be there was an amount that was being requested. Jonathan could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, we, in the packet that we sent earlier, there are a couple of different options, including a no public expenditure option. So and as we try to do with all projects, we try to work with individuals to help identify opportunities for cost savings, especially when they can be had in place of using public assistance. So those options had been explored. We had even discussed, you'll see another option in there with a TIF amount suggested at $750,000. The purpose for that was to at least be able to have the possibility of structuring something that could hold the school districts completely harmless. That did not work in this case. Our developer has worked to lower the price, but it's not been very significant. So at the end of the day, as we work through that process, you see those different options in the packet.
Oh,
that
yes.
really kind of shows that that negotiation process.
Well, Jonathan, you did a great job stepping down the $1,750,000, $500,000 down to the $415,000. So yeah, we get that and we understand that. So nicely done, and we have clarity and understanding. Councilman Myers, then Andre. Let's Scott go next. Andre.
No, thank you. I guess I'm in disagreement with my fellow council members. I support this proposal based on the recommendation of the Wayne Economic Development Council, the strong recommendation of the Worcester Area Chamber of Commerce, and the 5 major business leaders that came and expressed their desire to have housing developed in our community. It's a little bit interesting to see where the council members that voted to speculate $2 million on a real estate investment when the city has no development experience. But yeah, we have a developer with many years of successful development experience in our community, and we're not willing to support that. So I just thought it was, I think maybe some of the details, but Jonathan has given us so many options and varieties that I find it odd that we can't find one that would keep the city in a reasonable financial shape and still support this kind of a project that we need, and we need housing in Worcester.
Thank you, and Councilman Myers. That's why it's good to have differing opinions on council. Mr. Dordia?
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that some 25 plus years ago, we had a commercial TIF at Long Road, and that for the commercial development worked quite well. So someone, you had mentioned the fact that we have a tool belt, and we have used this quiver or this tool in our tool belt for the commercial area there at Long Road, and it's been very successful at that Long Road area. That's all I wanted to remind everyone of. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty. And Mr. Sanders, please.
I just say that I agree with Mr. Myers in terms of his comments. And one of the questions I have then is that throughout the last, 30 days, intensive 30 days, we've had conversations and we've tried to have additional conversation with, okay, what would we want as a council to set some type of standardized tip or some type of guidelines, which at this point, I've not heard anything really suggested other than extreme site development complexities and low income housing. So if those are the two criteria that we're willing to establish, is this the top point in time where we're going to then make those quantitative values applicable? And then at this point, I mean, there seems to be, but yet there seems to be a little bit of further discussion required on that. So I'm just throwing it out there. I mean, one of the things we tried to do was try to come up with some standards that everyone was going to be happy with, but yet, I mean, there's 7 of us on council, and I'm basically hearing 6 different options that may or may not be acceptable. So, my question is to the rest of the council: is there any way that we're going to be able to come up with some type of standardized value that we're willing to go with for future TIFs?
Well, and I'll respond to that. I think every project has to be reviewed and voted upon with their own unique perspectives and nuances. I will highlight, and I reiterate it, the 35% of public infrastructure seem to be a fair and consistent baseline. It allows the developer to pursue non-prevailing wage subcontractors to further reduce costs. It has a 10 to 11-year payback period and has no impact to the school. And if we want to add a blighted or a challenged area checkbox like the Long Road Initiative was as additional criteria, I think if it checks those boxes, I'm all in. But again, we also heard from other council members that they are opposed to almost any type of TIF, but that's the uniqueness of being elected. And we'll let the constituents be the voice of who they are represented by on council, because some people, it may not pass mustard at any level. But again, we know at the levels as outlined by the Ohio Revised Code, that's going to be perceived as too high by even moderates on council. And at that point in time, every project just has to proceed as outlined. And there are no, even with the abatements, Councilman Sanders, we've had ones that check all the boxes, but for some reasons, other reasons than the box check, were not approved.
Very few.
That's the dynamic of the council representation. So it is what it is. I wish it was easier in that regard. If you check all the boxes, and then they don't need us to interpret and represent, because then it's just filling the boxes. If they meet the criteria, it's acceptable. If they don't, it's not. So if you meet the criteria, then you don't need really council representatives per se. You could do that with expenditures and capital appropriation and budgets also. So good point. But this one was, again, there was, I will reiterate Councilman Myers' point. It was endorsed by some groups, but also was not endorsed by other economic development engines within our city. The Worcester Growth Corporation did not have an approval of this, and the Worcester City Schools vehemently opposed this. So it's 50-50, Councilman Myers. You got the chamber and the WEDC in favor of it, and you got two major factions within our community that are in opposition of it. So, and again, that provides some clarity in the polarization that we're seeing on council, because we have a divide on this. So I will summarize by saying that we can table this if we deem it appropriate, or proceed with it. And then we can put in a lesser version and we can vote on it in what, 4 weeks, or we can leave it stand and vote it down or up at our council session this evening. So now we're getting down to the final stages of our discussion. If we feel there's some merit, which based on the feedback tonight, even at the lowest level, this will not be approved. So that being noted, do we want to table it for some future review date and without starting the clock all over again? Or do we just want to let it go through as presented and vote on it this evening? And if we do resurrect it and start it up in the future, we start the clock ticking again? That's the $1 million question. Now, council members, I don't want your opinion on that right now. Let's go to the committee members. So we've had definitive directional discussion. We think we know where we stand on this important issue. Fellow committee members, is there merit to take the vote tonight as it stands? Mr. Myers.
Well, I think that the developer was pretty firm on this needing to get action in order for him to meet the construction timeline and window that they were looking at. If the general consensus is that they will not get support, then there's no reason to vote. And I think tabling it has the same effect probably of killing the development. So it's not going to happen. So yeah, I mean, I think either of those options are probably the same result is the project won't happen, the housing won't be built, and the 5 major employers who came and spoke to council were not heard.
Mr. Sanders.
Let me ask a quick question of Jonathan. What's the significant difference between what we're proposing here with our TIF legislation as we've presented it with the $1 million ask, and what's going on in Springfield at their with their 75% 10-year TIF legislation?
The Springfield project was 100% for 30 years. That was the TIF term that was established for their districts. They had a couple of districts that covered a housing development that was in excess of 200 units. The significant difference really comes down to how those fill in the blanks on the proposed 2020-2022 would be completed. And there is separately with that, there is what's called a plat agreement. The Springfield project, for instance, and sorry to pick on one community, but it was the delivery of lots specifically. So if some of the things that I've heard over the last few weeks is having a guarantee on the actual construction of homes. So that's one thing that's a little bit different as well. Those can kind of be handled with a separate infrastructure agreement or a plat agreement. In the case of Springfield, Ohio, the plat agreement became its own piece of legislation that took place after the TIF district was established. But in general, they're relatively similar as how they're set up today.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, though, one of the key items in the differentiation between the two is that the schools in Springfield didn't oppose this. They may not have supported it, but they didn't oppose it. Where it seems to be our biggest issue with this project is that the consternation that exists is simply because there's a feeling that the schools are going to get shorted out of their funds, which in actuality isn't the case, because we were going to keep them with the original TIF. We were going to keep them at 75% of what their actual collection rate was going to be.
I think that comes down into an issue when we're dealing with consumer-driven type development. If that development is going to occur in the marketplace anyway, and revenues are being forgone to have it occur in one specific location, then a payoff is needed either in terms of remediating blight or solving another community amenity. Should this development not move forward, the demand for housing in the city remains. And that would be something for the market to fill in eventually. And so I think that is one of the key differences between the city of Worcester, which has sustained its population growth, albeit while it's relatively anemic, it's light years ahead of other Northeastern Ohio communities. Springfield, Ohio, on the other hand, had lost over 10,000 residents. And so at that time, the market dynamics were very different, and it absolutely necessitated their use of TIF in order to develop housing in that location. Our market metrics are very different than that.
Thank you, Jonathan. So the consensus is, for other committee members, Jen, David, Mr. Silvestri, Ms. Warden?
Yeah, I mean, not to reiterate, but I'd like to just kind of say that I feel like the developer is the one who assumes the risk when you're building a housing development. I mean, I know we've been given a few examples and probably all of us have looked them up on our own as well. But it's relatively uncommon for taxpayers to back a profit-driven real estate developer, and I don't see why Worcester should be any different.
Thank you. Mr. Silvestri, you were pretty pointed in your feedback. Any additional comments?
I would just say, John, that I agree with what's been said in terms of, this type of a development. I can't in good faith support the subsidizing or the incentivizing of this type of a development. And for me, I think we should take the vote and on the very idea and see what the outcome is.
I would recommend, in summary, that we do defer to the original proposal as requested by the developer, and we call for the final vote this evening, and we then proceed accordingly. I think that's the most prudent. We're up to this point right now. If there are other options in the future, we can resurrect this concept and again, proceed accordingly. So very productive meeting. Thank you everyone for your candor, your preparation, your patience, and the hard work through the months getting to this point. I think we're positioned well this evening to call a vote and see what happens regarding this discussion. With that, Mr. Sanders, you can make the closing comments. I'm complete.
I just have a quick question. Mr. Scavelli, were there any notable comments or questions that we need to address while we still have a few minutes left?
There were not.
Okay. All right. Well,
Thank you.
While I'm not exactly thrilled with the potential outcome, I do appreciate everyone's input and candor in this situation. It will be interesting to see in our futures when this comes back to us again, how we're going to look at it. So again, all I can say is thank you for your work and effort in trying to dissect this relatively complicated piece of legislation.
Mr. Sanders, complicated is an understatement. This was a very, very unique situation, and hundreds of hours of work went into this. So again, thank you for the diligence and the honesty and candor. And with that being noted, we'll conclude the joint committee meeting for this evening and plan to resume. You can go to the bathroom and get a fresh cup of coffee or beverage, and then we'll reconvene in about 12 minutes.
Mr. Cavan had.
Oh, please, Mr.
I wanted to take the time to thank Jonathan for his excellent work. That was a ton of work. It was a lot to wade through. I can't imagine writing it all. Thank you so much.
If I could also ask Lynn and Jonathan to stay on with me after I take us off YouTube for just a second, that would be great.
Thank you, everyone. See you in a little bit.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Okay, so for Lynn and Jonathan.
What can we help you with?
So it sounds like we're going back to the original version.
Yeah.
most likely for it to be voted down. How do we want to handle that when we go in there? Do we just want to say that we're going back to the unamended version? Let me kick us off.
Oh, because we